So let's start off, Bob, with you quoting this quote that I know. Actually, could you talk a little bit about this?
Sure. I'm going to read a quote here from Invictus. And, you know, we had all kinds of people in prison. And the last 2 years of imprisonment were much less harsh than the first 6. And that happened because the Americans staged a rescue attempt at a prison to the west of Hanoi called Son-Tay. And even though it was unsuccessful, and it was unsuccessful because the Vietnamese had moved the prisoners out of the camp shortly before the rescue attempt. But where it was successful was it caused the Vietnamese to put us back into cells or into larger rooms, really, whereas before I'd been in solitary confinement. So it's amazing the amount of wisdom and memory that can combine out of a group of, say, 75 people as there were in this room. And some people, I mean, most of us were trained engineers, but others had a more liberal education, I suppose, and remembered poems and things like that we tried to memorize. And certainly one of them it's a very short poem, and it had a significant impact on us. And here it is. It says, "No matter how straight the gate, how charged the punishment, the scroll, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." So those are words that I think would ring and resonate in anybody's heart. You know, when you realize that when it all comes down to the brass tacks, you're the person that controls your own fate. And I think that's what got us through a lot. Now, if I could continue on and tell you some of the things that...
Please, you could set that up.
Did you want to...
Sure, we can do the reading. Would you mind, Bob?
Sure, not at all.
Let me go ahead. Carrie, do you need something?
I was going to take the paper.
Oh, okay. Okay, Ken, did you set? Yes, sir. All right, go ahead, Bob.
Okay, there's a poem called Invictus, and it's the last stanza of which it was written by William Ernest Hensley, and I'll just quote the last stanza. It's only 4 lines, but it has a lot of significance to a person that's in solitary confinement, say. And it says, "It matters not how straight the gate, how charged the punishments, the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." And those words really resonated with us and I think helped us get through some tough times.
And did you tap these words to the walls to each other?
We did, yes. That's how we originally, and I'm not sure who originally came up with this, but there was one guy named Ron Webb that seemed to remember a lot of quotes like this. I remember he also quoted the poem, the Cremation of Sam McGee, so we all tried to memorize that. And then I'm speaking of the last 2 years of the war where torture had been reduced quite a bit. There was, okay. Another thing that we would do, well, I'll tell the story, you can fit it in wherever you want. But in the last 2 years of the war, the Vietnamese were somewhat kinder to us. And there was a lot of up and down stuff that went on there because the Americans and the Vietnamese were meeting in Paris trying to negotiate an end to the war. And for months they would argue over the shape of the negotiation table as to whether it was square, or rectangular, or oval, or circular, or whatever. But while all this was going on, we were supporting each other with trying to memorize the Invictus and things like that. There was one guy that had studied Russian, and so he had us all memorize this one Russian story, and it was a Tolstoy story, and I can remember part of it. It's "Shli polosu davat tovarischa and vyskachik na nik medvet." And what it was is it's about 2 guys that are walking through the woods, and they come across a bear, and one guy climbs up a tree, and the other guy lies down and plays dead. And the moral of the story is that when you're in trouble, you can't afford to just play dead. So anyway, those are kind of memory things that we would go through, and there are quite a number of others.
Tell me, sir, if you would, about the Pennsylvania polka.
Oh, well, Admiral Stockdale got the idea that we ought to all, as a form of communication, have a theme song associated with us, because, say, a guard would come and take out Sam Johnson, who lived next to me, and take him off to quiz. And we might not know about that, but as the guy was being marched out to quiz, Sam would hum The Yellow Rose of Texas, I think was his song, because he was from Texas. I was from Pennsylvania, so my theme was the Pennsylvania polka. And this is just another way of communicating that who we were and where we were heading for.
And would you mind, sir, just humming a little bit of the Pennsylvania polka?
Da 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 da. Yeah, I can't remember the words, to be honest with you, but that's kind of the way it went.
Beautiful, beautiful. So this was, you each had a signature song.
That's right.
That you would communicate with.
Right.
And then you tell a story of George being a little bit, what should we say, resistant to passing information at one point.
Yeah. Well, to set the stage for the story, it deals with George Coker, who was a really junior naval officer. I think he flew in he flew in an A6 as a bombardier navigator. But he was the baby of the group, and his ticket into Alcatraz was that he and another guy named George McKnight had attempted an escape, and they were successful in making it down to the main river, which is called the Red River, and they floated down the river, but unfortunately got caught, and that was their ticket into Alcatraz, because they were real resistors. But we had the senior guys in this Alcatraz 11 was Jerry Denton, who later became a senator from the state of Alabama. And he was down on the end. In most of these cells, I think there were, say, 8 of them, all lined up side by side. But the most senior guy was Jim Stockdale, a commander then, who later ran for the vice presidency of the United States. And he was in a separate building that was probably about 75 feet away from the row of the others. But anyway, the two seniors would discuss policy, and one would come up with a kind of a voluminous, wordy policy, and to transmit it, it had to go from Denton to McKnight's cell, to Coker's cell, to Tanner's cell, and then across the courtyard with finger signals to Stockdale. Stockdale would generate a reply, and it would come back Stockdale to Tanner to Coker to McKnight to Denton. It kind of reminds you there's some poem about a baseball triple play. But anyway, George would pick up the information coming, say, from Denton off the left wall, and it would be a long series of sentences, and then he would move to the right wall and transmit it to Tanner, and then after a couple of days, after it eventually got to Stockdale, the reply would come back again kind of lengthy, and George would have to pick it up off the right wall, remember it, and then move it to the left wall and send it to McKnight and eventually to Denton. Well, you can imagine the strain that was on the in-between people. And George came up with a solution, which backfired on him. He would copy from the left wall what the message that Denton was sending to Stockdale, and then he would wait an appropriate amount of time as if the message had gone on, which it really hadn't. And after a day or two, a reply had been generated and was coming back in the other direction. George would then make up his own reply and send it back to Denton. And apparently this went on for a couple of months, I think, until he got tripped up in his own chicanery, and they caught him, you know. So anyway, he survived, but anyway, they were pretty upset with him.
Great story. I love that.
I'll tell you another story about, again, the last couple years of the war. And again, we started in this room. It was called room number 7. And there were 75 of us in there. And after a couple of months, they decided to have a sort of a birthday party for me. It really wasn't a birthday. It was my 6th anniversary of being a POW. So people put on little skits and things like that. Well, about this time, the Vietnamese thought we were staging a revolution or so. And so the door banged open. In came guards with rifles and gas masks on. And they hauled away all the senior guys that were above the rank of, were commanders or above. And they hauled them off and put them in leg irons for a couple of months, as a matter of fact. So we were left then with about 45 guys in this room. And every Saturday night, we would have movies. But we didn't have a projector, and we didn't have a screen, and we didn't have the film. What we had was John McCain, who had a marvelous memory for remembering movies that he'd seen in his youth. And so he would come to the center of the group, and all these 45 guys would cluster around him, and he would tell the story. And it often happened that his stories would take longer than the actual film took to tell. So he told one called The Quiet Man. It was John Wayne talking about an Irish boxer. And so it was pretty entertaining, and we looked forward every Saturday night to this. Well, anyway, after our release, I happened to be in San Diego at a hotel, and I had agreed to have breakfast the next morning with another Alcatraz 11 guy named Harry Jenkins. And so I was waiting for him at the breakfast table in the restaurant. Down he comes, and he's kind of sleepy-eyed and all irritable. And I said, "What's the problem?" And he said, well, he hadn't been able to sleep the previous night, so at 2 o'clock in the morning, he turned on the room television set, and there was this movie playing, The Quiet Man by John Wayne. And I told him, well, Harry, that sure explains why you're sleepy, but why are you so upset? He said it was nothing at all like McCain described. He just made it up. So anyway, we had some humorous times over there, too.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I understand you were pretty good yourself at inventing breakfasts.
Oh, yeah. I had a guy, one of the Alcatraz 11 was a guy named Ron Storrs. He was an Air Force captain. And he and I lived side by side for almost 3 years. And we really helped each other a lot. You know, he had a passion for New York Broadway plays, and he would tap that through the wall, and you know, I would reciprocate with other stuff. But anyway, we decided that, by the way, we weren't getting much to eat, and our main diet was cabbage soup. But for 6 months in a row, we'd have cabbage soup. It'd just be a little a bowl of broth with maybe one cabbage leaf in the thing. And you get kind of tired of cabbage soup. And now the Vietnamese were pretty successful in keeping us from talking to each other or making any kind of noise. But in the middle of the end of '67, the Americans were hitting Hanoi pretty hard. There were days when there'd be 6 air raids against Hanoi in one day. And you can imagine the noise, the cacophony that goes on with bombs going off and AAA being shot and SAM rockets launching and whatnot. And I heard this American voice coming from the other side of the camp, which was really unusual because I hadn't heard an American voice in a long time. And he was shouting. And he was shouting as if he were calling to the American pilots that were diving in afterburner and all the noise. He was shouting, "Bomb the cabbage patches." And so anyway, I don't know whether it had any effect, but you can live with kind of a minimal diet. And we knew it was minimal because when we tried to stand up, we would black out because our hearts couldn't adapt to the increased load of standing up. So you learned how to accommodate, you know. You'd hold on to something as you stood up, and the world would turn kind of gray for a while, but after a while, you know, it would clear up and you'd be okay. But you asked me about this next door guy. This is, in a way, it's kind of a sad story because Ron Stores was tougher than most. I mean, he just really was a patriot, an ultra patriot, as a matter of fact. And he eventually died over there. But before he died, we decided that we would have breakfast every Sunday, and I would be the host on one Sunday, and the following Sunday he would be the host. And so we would concoct, of course this was all in our mind, elaborate breakfasts. And he would produce one Sunday, I remember he had eggs Benedict, and of course we had champagne and cinnamon rolls, and all in your imagination. But you can just completely lose yourself in exercises like that.
And tell me, has there been a time since when you sat down to breakfast in a fine restaurant or something and looked at the fare and thought, what comes to you? Because then now you're actually have the freedom.
Well, I suppose so. Yeah, I like breakfast better than any other meal, and particularly Belgian waffles, And that was one of the meals I served them over there. And when that happens, the thought comes back to what went on for about 3 years over there.
And I believe Jim Mulligan was pretty good at designing dinners, right? He would create a meal for Stockdale each.
I think he did, but I'm not a witness to that, because really, Mulligan was in this three-man building, three-cell building, and I didn't have direct communication with him. In fact, he had a tougher time than most of us because he was not in the full line of communication there.
Let's talk about, you've been talking about the ways you occupy yourself. You had a particular passion, a dream that held you together about when you got out.
Right.
Talk to me about that.
Well, I was a bachelor for a long time. And in fact, I was 30 years old before I got married, and I met this wonderful girl from Montreal, and we got married and had a son shortly thereafter, and he was only 3 weeks old when I was shot down, and so she wouldn't let him watch television during the wartime. She lived in a suburb of San Diego. And she wouldn't let him watch television because the war was being played out in the living rooms of the United States, during that war. And so consequently, he had to learn to read early, and so he became a pretty good student, and eventually spent 4 years at Harvard and 4 years at Yale and 7 years at Dartmouth. So he's quite a bright guy. But since I was so newly married, we lived in rented houses, and so I dreamed about providing a house for my wife Lorraine, and so this became an obsession on my part, and so I would tap to my right-hand neighbor Sam Johnson, the congressman, and I would solicit from him houses that he had bought and how much he'd paid for them. And I must have driven the poor guy nuts, because, I would calculate how much a new house would cost per square foot and different arrangements. And then I'd get Ron Stores' input. And so in my own mind, I would concoct this house. And I wanted to build this house on open land. And I think that was a reaction to being cooped up so long in a small cell that I wanted to be able to look out and see trees and not live in a metropolitan area. And so I would design this house and calculate how many bricks were in it and how many board feet of lumber and how many nails were in it. And it was a good mental exercise. And then after I had designed the perfect house, then I'd say to myself, well, maybe I ought to move the fireplace over to this place and start all over again. So this went on, like I say, 2.5 years or so. And so after I was, by the way, with all these calculations, I figured I could build this house on a cost of $35,000. So when I was released and came back, and I still stayed in the Navy for quite some time afterwards, I found a piece of property that is called a fall-away property, where where out of the back you look over a pasture. It's on 8 acres, and there's a river behind us. So we built this house, and then my wife added a few her ideas into it too. She had lived in California and had some ideas about redwoods ceilings and things, and it turned out quite nicely. But I had miscalculated the impact of inflation over these 8 years, so it cost about 10 times more than I had figured.
We plan to do some aerial photography with a drone when we're working at your home with you, and one of the shots we'd like to do is you on your tractor. So could you mention just your tractor, what it is, just a little anecdotal story, and what you do with it?
Yeah, well, on 8 acres, the grass grows pretty fast, and at the time we moved out there, we had 2 horses, and we were without grandchildren. Our son became a neurosurgeon and was married, but they hadn't had any children. So we decided to fill the vacuum of no grandchildren by breeding this one horse called Standing Ovation. And horses have a gestation period of 11 months. So we waited with anticipation, and out came the perfect colt, and his name was Windsock. It had to have an aeronautical theme to it. And so we trained the horse and Windsock, and it was just a marvelous experience. And now I've lost track of the
tractor.
Oh, the tractor. Oh, yes. So you can imagine that the grass grows pretty fast on an 8-acre place. About half this 8 acres is in grass pasture, and the rest is in woods. But there's a lot of grass to cut if you don't have horses. And we eventually gave the horses away, but we still had the grass to cut. So I needed a tractor, and I found this used tractor called a Ford Jubilee, and it had an implement on it called a backhoe, not a backhoe, a bush hog. And so I was pretty busy at the time. I was stationed in the Pentagon. So on Saturdays, I'd run this bush hog around cleaning things up. And so eventually we got rid of the Ford Jubilee, it was called, and bought this new tractor. And the tractor, it's called a Kubota. And it has a front lift on it, and it has implements that you can put on the back of it. And it's important that you balance the two. And so I had a load of logs. I'm forever cutting down trees, big trees, and cutting up logs and putting them in the front. And I must have had, 700 or 800 pounds of logs in the front of this lifter. And in the back, where I was supposed to have the bush hog, which probably weighs about 500 or 600 pounds, I had nothing. So I came down this slope, and there's a term in aviation called a snap roll. And that's what happened to this tractor. The thing flipped on me upside down, and I was underneath the thing. I had to look up at it and reach up and shut it off. And my wife was out playing golf at the time, so I had to crawl all the way a couple hundred yards to the house. And when my wife came in off the golf course, it was a dark house, and she relates the story about how the first voice she hears is, "It's me in bed. I'm okay. I can wiggle my hands and feet." Well, she called 911, and that did it for me for a while.
Wow. And mention, if you would, that you have a pastime right out your back door that you do. What is that?
I'm sorry, what?
Your driving tee. Just mention that, because we're going to film that coming up.
Yeah. Well, in my Navy career, I had 3 really choice assignments, and they were in Monterey, California, which is best known for its golf courses, like Pebble Beach and Cypress Point and things. Now, my desire in life was to be a good golfer, and I never quite achieved that goal. But I keep trying even to this day. And so in my backyard, which is in grass, it's kind of a pasture, I put white stakes about every 10 yards, and I have a tee set up so that I can get maybe 140 yards, and it's a calculated range then. But in all truth, I'd have to tell you that that it really hasn't improved my game a whole lot, but it's a lot of fun. And then I have to go out and pick up the balls. You know, we have a neighbor's dog I've been trying to train how to pick up the balls, but he's kind of reluctant to do that. But I will tell you one other golf story. And one of my last jobs in the Navy was to be the superintendent, or most people would call it the president, of the Naval Postgraduate School, which is located in Monterey, California. And that's a school with about 1,800 students. They're mostly naval officers that are about 30 years old or so, and they're working on either their master's or sometimes on their doctorate degrees in a variety of fields. Well, associated with this Naval Postgraduate School was a golf course, and I used to play on it on the weekends. My house was located on the grounds there, and it was quite a nice house. And along with the job came a gardener who was a Hispanic man. And I don't speak Spanish, but as I'd walk to work, I would greet him in the morning, and he would greet me back, and we had a friendly rapport. But I had heard that he was a pretty good golfer. So anyway, one Sunday, my wife and I are out with another couple, and my best drive is usually about 150 yards, and I got a good 150 yards out of the drive, and then I stepped up and hit my second shot, another 150 yards. So I'm out at 300 yards, about the time when the Hispanic gardener and his foursome are coming on in the opposite direction on a parallel fairway. And so he shouts on over, "Great drive, Admiral," thinking that my 300 yards was my first drive. And I didn't want to make a big scene, and I just said to myself, well, tomorrow morning when I see him, I'll correct the error. Well, wouldn't you know it, the poor guy died that night. And so in my heart, I've never been able to rectify the misunderstanding, and maybe someday I'll meet him and get it straight.
That's beautiful, man. That's really beautiful. Red McDaniel said something to me that I thought was so compelling. He said, at a certain point in life, Patrick, you begin to think more about your eulogy than your resume. And I felt like it put into perspective so many things about, as a young man, we're all thinking about the future and trying to build a future and everything else. And so young midshipmen today are all about their careers and thinking about what's coming and everything else. And then there was those who would say, by the time we get to the place where we have wisdom to reflect on our lives are nearly over. If you could go back in time and see yourself, speak to yourself as a young midshipman when you were at the Naval Academy, and give yourself a piece of advice or several pieces of advice, correct something that you might want to help yourself understand, what would it be?
Well, so looking back in time, you know, I'm 85 years old now, and ex-prisoners are starting to die off. In fact, in the Alcatraz 11, there are only 5 of us living right now. So we are kind of transitioning from resume to eulogy, although I haven't written my eulogy yet. I'm hoping to postpone that by 10 years or so. But when I was a midshipman, though, and speaking to the midshipmen, I'm not so sure I changed a whole lot of my career and my thinking at the time. Although I think, in looking back, I think I would challenge myself a bit more than I did, and I would try to take a little bit more risk than I did as I went through my initial years as a military officer. And but I think I threw everything I had into the game, and I would recommend to a midshipman looking at a military career, give it everything you have, and take some risk, and recognize that there is a seniority chain, but yet don't be intimidated so much that you're afraid to talk to your boss. I think my advice to a midshipman would be, as you're working your way up through the ranks, become a generalist. That is, know a lot about a lot of things, but become a specialist in some one element, so that when the need for information about that one element in which you're an expert comes up, they're going to say, go talk to Ensign McNish or something, or because he's the expert in this field. And so you have to be known as being an expert in some particular field.
Are you familiar, sir, with the expression "back U.S."?
Sure.
And talk to me about unity before self.
Okay. We about halfway through our imprisonment, some of the senior people thought that we ought to have a slogan around which we could rally. And I'm pretty sure it was Admiral Jim Stockdale, then commander, that came up with this slogan, and it simply said, "Back U.S." Well, it has a couple of connotations to it. Certainly, that our slogan was, we were going to get back to the U.S., back U.S. But each individual letter stood for something. Now the Vietnamese always, their culture was that one of obedience to seniors were people in their own culture would bow to each other. So the B stood for we weren't going to bow to these people. The A stood for stay off the air, because they tried to get people to make recordings that they would play on their propaganda. Don't confess was the C, and we always spelled B-A-C-K in our tap code. We substituted C for K, so our fourth K substitutes C was don't confess. So don't bow, stay off the air, don't confess, and don't. I lost it now. We may have to do this again.
Don't kiss the enemy.
Oh, no, don't kiss the enemy goodbye. That was it, yeah. We may have to do that over again. And certainly the U.S. has one connotation, the United States, but in our connotation was united we stand. So back U.S. meant a lot to us.
When I was speaking with Ev Alvarez, he said that the Vietnamese never really understood the American soldier. There was, for instance, in the Vietnamese culture, in the communist culture, there is a huge impetus on indoctrination, bringing someone over to their point of view. In America, we don't actually even consider it. We consider our point of view is so great that we don't even think we have to indoctrinate anyone. Most people want to be here. So it's a very, very different thing. We wouldn't even think of having, let's say, a Vietnamese prisoner and saying we need you to make statements about the greatness of America. It just wouldn't even come into our thinking. There would be nothing to be gained by it. So it illustrates a huge difference between a communist society and a free society. One is, in effect, the communist society is showing a kind of self-consciousness, an actual insecurity by saying we have to convince you of who we are.
I think I can relate something to this, and that is that most of the midshipmen are familiar with a certain hierarchy in the military, that a lieutenant commander is senior to a lieutenant. But in the Asian world, or certainly in the Vietnamese world, the commanding officer of, say, a platoon or a company, they have a military commander and they have a political commander, and they call them a cadre, political cadre, and so the role of the political cadre is to indoctrinate all the people in his company according to the communist line. And I guess in battle, the military commander would take over. But that's completely abnormal to the American way of looking at things, and there are a lot of cultural differences. Now maybe it's unfair to state this, but I don't think their culture appreciates the sense of humor that Americans do. And I'll tell you this story about how I was being interrogated once by a guy named the Rabbit, and he said, "Tell me, Shumaker," again mispronouncing my name, and this was several years after I'd been in prison. Do you think your wife is remaining true to you while you're here? And I realized, boy, if I show any emotion in the answer to this question, he'll start driving his Mack truck right down my emotional throat. And so I said, no. I says, by this time, she's probably run off and married the Iceman. Well, he gets out his dictionary and looks up ice and man, and maybe the midshipmen don't know what an Iceman is. This guy didn't. In my day, that's what refrigerators were stocked with. And then he finally looked up from his dictionary and said, he says, you Americans have a strange sense of humor.
That's so good.
and the same guy again one time told me he was reading the literature from that was printed in the United States, and at that time, and even today, there was a movement where women were trying to establish equal rights with men. And we called it the feminine movement. And that's what he read one thing. And he said, now what is this about a feminine movement? And I said, well, a feminine movement, that's the way a woman wiggles when she walks. And he didn't understand that either. That may get me in trouble with your viewers here.
No, not at all. Our viewers are military. They can certainly understand that. But on this subject, when there was a time in Alcatraz referred to as the Stockdale Purge, where they were really trying to, in the Vietnamese mind, there must have been a central committee. The U-11 at Alcatraz were what, in their estimation, must have been a central committee. But they were trying to find out who was senior, who was passing down the initial orders, and through a series of tortures and stuff, they were able to identify Stockdale. And so he was brought in, his knee was broken again during this interrogation, but they kept insisting, you must give us the names of the Central Committee. In the communist world, there is the ruling Politburo, and there's everyone else who follows orders, right? And so they felt if they could break the Central Committee, that all resistance would fall. And Admiral Stockdale kept saying, there is no Central Committee. If you kill me...
That was his line. I mean, it's a serpent, you cut off the head and another will come forth.
Exactly. So speak to me, sir, if you would, about how the leadership structure, because what Stockdale ended up doing, maybe you're familiar with the story, was he gave them 230 names, wrote them all out. And they were, first of all, appalled that he knew the intel on how many prisoners were around, because it revealed how little effect they were having on breaking communication. But additionally, he was saying to them, we're a very different system than yours. Speak to me about that if you can.
Well, this is a story where the Vietnamese were trying to rout out the leaders of the group and the chain of command. And so they went to work on Stockdale, tortured him pretty badly until he finally had to give them something. And he was a pretty smart fellow, a graduate of Stanford University and the U.S. Naval Academy. He's a statue of Stockdale is at the Naval Academy. And at that time, we had about 250 POWs. And through our TAP code, we charged each of the POWs with doing the best they could to remember these names, primarily because if they escaped, they would carry these names with them. So Stockdale, the Vietnamese were expecting them to say, well, Denton is his second in command, somebody else is his third in command. Instead of that, Stockdale listed all 256 of these people, and he said, look, he says, when you whack off the head of this serpent, another head's going to pop up, and so we're all going to be leaders. And so it just illustrated the difference between the way the Occidental world viewed leadership and the way the Asian world did.
And speak to me, sir, if you can, about how you saw the American military mind at work in terms of leadership and hierarchy of authority and that very thing that at any moment in time you're expected to step up. How that worked in the Hanoi prison system to help you be more effective in your resistance and also to thrive.
Well, I think most of the POWs over there, and certainly those that had graduated from the Naval Academy, had that embedded in them as just part of their being, that there was an obligation they had to take charge if they were senior, or to follow their leaders, if they were junior. And this is just so ingrained in their understanding of what leadership is, that there was no question about who was in charge, and that if Stockdale issued an order, by golly, we do our best to follow it.
And remembering in part that our first audience for this is young midshipmen. Now you have someone coming fresh out of plebe summer. The idea that they might be thrust into the feet of leadership suddenly, and that they might have to step up in ways that maybe in their first year or second year they're thinking, I'm a junior, So this idea behind the power of military discipline, that, for instance, my understanding is when a new guy would come in, the first order of business was to get contact with him, get his name, who is this? But really the second question was always, what's your rank? You would always need to establish who was senior, because then this chain of command could remain unbroken. Speak to me about that, because we're trying to get, in part, the lessons of what you learned there for young officers to realize the gravity of leadership, that it can be thrust on you in any moment, in any circumstance that you can't anticipate, and be the ability to step up and face what you do, sometimes alone, is really important.
Well, we all come with different personalities. Some are introverts, some extroverts, but they can all be leaders. And even if they are self-conscious or introverts, you can develop techniques of leadership. But our culture in the military, and I suspect in industry as well, is that somebody's got to be responsible. And it flows all through the organization. And I think, good leadership, a person in that leadership chain realizes that the leadership flows up and it flows down too. And a lot of times the junior guy comes up with a pretty neat idea, and the senior person has to suppress his ego and say, hey, that guy's got a good idea, we'll follow that way. But I think it was just ingrained in us. I can appreciate how, say, a high school kid goes to the Naval Academy and he gets suddenly thrust into a role. I'll tell you a story. I was a boxer at the Naval Academy, and in plebe summer, I took a blow to my mouth and it knocked my 2 front teeth out. So, but I was made the company officer of the 5th Company, and so my parents came down after we'd gone through plebe summer. And if you've never heard a guy try to say, with 2 missing front teeth, say, 4th Company, forward march, you have a challenge on your hands. But you're thrust into leadership roles like that, and you just have to accept it and realize that you're accepting, not because you're such a neat guy, but you're there because someone needs you to fill that role, and you have a responsibility to do the best you can. So somehow I got out 4th Company forward march, and they all marched.
Wonderful, wonderful. And one of the spots I'll ask Carrie to send you the link is that we did for the Integris project was We shot a boxing spot. I'll send it to you. As a boxer, you will really appreciate it.
Okay, good.
Um, okay, we covered that. Oh, yeah. So, one of the things that the project is also eventually we assume will be helpful for is people who are in tough moments of self-doubt or struggling with whatever can take heart in your experience. There are people today, for instance, who are dealing with depressive episodes, and one of the tough things about depression for people who have gone through war experiences or what is that the world around them can be looking at them and say, you have a great life, you have no reason to be depressed, but that doesn't answer why you don't want to get up out of bed in the morning. And it's a very tough thing when the chemistry of your brain is holding you down and you don't actually have a reason. You don't have in those cells at the most abject times, you had more than enough reason for despondency and despair, and you reached, as you told the story of trying to take your life, those moments. And honestly, I don't even know how to respond with my sense of your courage. But is there things we can learn from your experience about what would keep you going? When you found the courage to move forward, what did you reach into? Is there things we can learn from you?
Well, I hope there are things that people can learn from our experience. And for the past, I don't know, 30 years or so, I seem to be asked to give a lot of speeches, to clubs and to schools and things like that. And for a long time, I used to give them a half hour worth of what happened to me. I was shot down and did this and this and I've realized over the past year or so that that people seem to like to hear me talk, but I think the reason why is because they like to project themselves into the thought of, do I have the stamina to have, if I were in that situation, would I have survived? I think that's going through their minds. But I've changed my outline now, because I think all lives are filled with stress, financial or marital or health stresses and things. So I've kind of changed my outline to be not just about me and my experience in Vietnam, but ideas I have on how to relieve stress. And certainly there's some chemistry involved, in depression, but there are ways you can overcome it. Again, some medical techniques to overcome depression, but again, like Invictus said there, I'm the master of my soul. You've got to find somewhere in your guts to overcome all this stuff and to stand up and say, hey, life is worth living, and that's what happened to me. What kept me going was I wanted to go back to New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, my little hometown of 1,000 people or so, and walk down the main street and look people in the eye and say, hey, I did the best I could. And so, there are techniques you can use to overcome this despondency. And, we used to joke too about, hey, hang in there, and we want to come back to the land of the big PX. That's the base exchange or post exchange, because we could, in a way, our culture is built around a lot of materialism, and I think we maybe gone too far in that direction. But anyway, that was the motivation for a lot of people back there, was they wanted to come back and be able to buy a new car and stuff like that. And but I think the more significant thing is to come back, be proud of what you did, and reintegrate with your family and get on with life, because this was an 8-year period in my life. I'm 85 years old, so it represents only 10% of my life. And Charlie Plum has a good line in his talks, and that is, he talks about driving a car down the road and some guy comes behind him and right on his bumper and cuts him off and stuff, and he's cursing at him as he goes by. But then he says to himself, "Hey, I'm only hurting myself," and that guy goes driving on without a second thought, But you just have to get over it and live your life, in a forward-looking sense.
I think you've touched again, you've recircled back. This is called the Return with Honor Project. When you said that what kept you going was the idea you could go back to your hometown and walk down the street and say, "I did the best I could."
Right.
That is an honorable statement, sir. That is at the core of that.
Well, I think also your family pride is important too, and that, I had a lot to live up to, and a minister as a grandfather, and an attorney as a father, and a author as a mother, and I didn't want to let them down either, or my wife.
On that subject, well, let's start with. Did you have religious or spiritual feelings about life that helped you through your Hanoi experience?
Well, yes and no. I certainly believe in God. I'm not a strong churchgoer. My wife is a Catholic, but I drew on my belief in Christianity while I was over there. I don't think I went overboard on that, but we did have, that was a strong element in our group. And in this room 7, when we had, say, 75 people, we had one guy, Howie Dunn, now passed on, but he was the minister, and we had a choir in which I participated with 2 or 3 guys, and we'd start each meal with a saying grace. So I think in varying degrees, some people were more religious than others. There were probably some atheists among us. I don't know, but I'm sure everybody drew strength from their spiritual beliefs.
It seems that the story of the Hanoi POWs is in many ways a story of the dark night of the soul and a kind of spiritual redemption, because each of you were reduced, each of you were broken, each of you in the darkness and solitude had to find something. And each of you that I've spoken to speaks about what these other men came to mean to you, the brotherhood, and how that sustained you, the unity that you felt with each other. Can you speak to me about that, please?
Well, if you were to take a room with 75 people in it and lock them up for a couple of years, you'd be amazed at the university-like atmosphere that you can create. We didn't have books or pencils or anything like that, but we had people that were willing to share of themselves, and people that had specific knowledge about a language or mathematics or a variety of things, and we supported each other that way. And so I think that's important, not only for your own self-esteem, but also in helping others. And we had some funny times there. I'll tell you one story about how we had a Marine that was in this group of 45 in room 7, and the Oriental world celebrates a special New Year's, and they call it Tet, T-E-T, and so we benefited occasionally when Tet would come around, that the Vietnamese would give us a little bit more food, and in fact, this one Tet, they even gave us a little bit of orange blossom liqueur in the bottom of our cups. It was about 1/4 of an inch, so we all realized that you couldn't get a buzz on or anything just drinking a little bit of hoosh like that. So these 45 guys decided that we'd pour it into one cup and raffle it off. So this Marine named Larry Freeze won the raffle, but we wouldn't let him drink the stuff until we conducted this psychological experiment. We had a little stone that we'd found, and we etched into the concrete on the floor some squares. The squares had 6 rows and 6 columns, and they had the numbers 1 through 36 randomly scattered throughout them. And we made 3 of these squares. Again, the numbers were all random, covered up with our T-shirts. So we had figured out through differential equations that a 39-inch piece of string on which was a little bar of soap would swing back and forth with a 2-second period. So that was our clock, and we didn't have any watches or anything. So we, before he drank this stuff, we uncovered the first square, and he had to point out while the clock was running, here's number 1, where's 2, there's 2, 3's up here. Finally, he got to 36, and we stopped the clock. And it took him something like 31 seconds to go through there. So then we had him drink the hooch, and 15 minutes later, and then again 30 minutes later, we uncovered square number 2 and then square number 3. And the whole premise was that drinking alcohol slows down your reactions, and so we were proving a scientific, what we thought was a fact. I don't know, maybe it was because he was a Marine, but the damn guy kept getting faster on us, and it completely ruined our theory.
I love that. That's such a great story. Fantastic story. We talk a lot today about the returning warrior, whether it's from the Afghan war or the Iraq war or whatever it is. And I think that the story of Vietnam is in many ways the story of our country. Like, there's a way in which we can look at Vietnam now in ways that we haven't been able to for 30, 40 years. And it seems that human beings need enough distance and time from something to really see it as their own story. But we came into Vietnam with sort of a John Wayne feeling of ourselves. We had military technology and superiority and everything else. And I think the story of the POWs in many ways is the story of America, in the sense that one of the poignant things that each of you has told me is the moment when you're shot out of your plane, you eject and you begin to float down. In your case, you hit so fast it didn't happen. But for many of them, they talk about the moment when they're parachuting down and they hear this and they realize they're being shot at. And for fighter pilots who do their missions and return to a carrier and go have coffee or whatever it is, that return to the safety of a carrier, the idea that, one, they were that exposed and that now it was ground fire, and like as Charlie said to me, part of me was like, wait a minute, don't you know who we are? We're American pilots. You're shooting at us. And it was the beginning of a kind of reality set in, and the country was learning at the same time that you men were learning that we're vulnerable in a way that we didn't understand. We can't just take endless pain and not respond. We can't just dominate a war by technology alone. There are many, many factors that are going to go into this. So in so many ways we can learn about ourselves from your stories as well. One of the questions that the Stockdale Center is keen on examining and exploring is, as a returning warrior who went through this horrendous experience, a truly inhuman experience in Vietnam in many ways, were there things like you talk about giving talks where people, I almost characterize it as a kind of voyeuristic curiosity about the torture. And it's as you say, I believe that's exactly right, that people want to hear the stories because they can hear all that didn't happen to me. There's this strange, but there was a lot of loneliness in the Hanoi prison systems. When you returned, the country needed something from you, and that may or may not have been what you needed at all. We are trying to understand how best to welcome the returning warrior back home and into society. Can you talk, if you can, about something?
Sure. We're talking about what it was like when we returned from imprisonment, and it was kind of a tough adjustment. Now, some people would claim that that's the first war that the United States has ever lost. There's controversy about that, but the sad thing is that actually millions of American soldiers and sailors and airmen fought over there, suffered over there, and returned to the United States to an ungrateful nation. And that's kind of a black mark on our society, I think. And in contrast to that, the POWs came back. Now I think the way it happened was, I think the United States needed something good coming out of that war, and the behavior of the POWs was something good. And so they got kind of elevated, and it caused me some embarrassment, because here I'm getting a parade in my honor, and some guy that got his leg shot off or something, was limping along without any recognition. I think we've rectified. It's about 50 years since that war happened, and I think just in the last 10 years or so, we're starting to, recognize the sacrifice that regular soldiers and sailors made in that war. But it was kind of hard coming back because there was an operation. It was called Homecoming, in which even before we were released, our wives and parents went through some psychological lecturing, about what to expect of these people and whatnot. And because the world, you don't realize how fast and what a dynamic society we live, how things can change over 8 years of time. And so, for example, when I got behind the wheel of a car and it came to say a four-way stop, I wasn't really sure whether to trust the guy on the right to stop or not. I don't know, I guess I lost some faith in the individual's ability to follow the rules. But and it just took me some time to get back into the swing of things. I think that it was an experience that all the other POWs experienced. But the government was really kind to us in that, I got military assignments that I wanted to get, and they certainly looked after our physical needs. In fact, every year, a lot of people go back for a physical exam, and the results of their exams are compared with others who weren't POWs to see, in a comparison sense, the effects of imprisonment. And my understanding is that the ones that were actually imprisoned are a little healthier than the comparison group, which probably makes you believe that you shouldn't be smoking and drinking, which we didn't do, and the comparison did do. So anyway, a lot of these former POWs are somewhat advanced in age, as I am, and suffering like the rest of their contemporaries with Alzheimer's problems and various other health issues. But we're still in there swinging, a lot of us.
Is there something that, from your experience, you could say about the needs of the returning warrior? There's the expectations everyone has, but then there's the real needs that the returning warrior has.
Well, I think if it happens again, we ought to treat the people much as we were treated, that is, with recognition and without condemnation or anything, but realizing that people that have been under that stress are going to need some understanding that their behavior might not be quite up to normal for a while.
And let's see, we've got. Okay, so at this point, do you need a break, sir? Would it be nice?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Let's take a break.
Final break.
Yeah.
We'll just
Okay.
finish up. So we'll cut